Hello everyone. Today I just want to take the time to thank Hitchhiker and Typical Madman for popping my live stream cherry a few weeks ago. I'm absolutely honored that you both asked me to join your live streams. I wound up actually doing 2 streams that night, and I really thought it would be a long time before I was ever invited to just one. I really felt like a cool kid. So thank you both so much. You have no idea how much that meant, and it was really great talking to you both and everyone in those streams. Both Hitchhiker and Typical Madman have really awesome channels. They will be linked below for you. Make sure that you check them out. Also, I have to add, thank you guys so much for helping me reach 100 subscribers in my first month here doing this channel. I would have never expected that in a million years, so thank you so much for the support. Honestly, I know it was definitely the right choice to make this channel and join this community. It's been wonderful so far. And if you're not subscribed yet and you would like to be, make sure you click that blood red button down below, subscribe, and make sure you click the little bell symbol so that you never miss a video. Again, thank you guys so much. Really, that was the best Christmas present I can ask for. So now, let's get creepy. You don't know me, but you need to listen. I have worked at the Hasbro company for 15 years. I would give my name, but what I'm about to say is not only illegal, it is dangerous. Santa Claus can't be trusted. Yes, that Santa Claus. The worst kept secret of the toy companies? Santa Claus is real. For the last century, companies like Hasbro have lived side by side with the man up north. We understood that he owned the month of December. We would slide a few sales from parents on the days leading up to Christmas by him, but he controlled it all. It all changed last year when the owner of Hasbro, Brian Goldner, gave the company to his daughter, Pandora, the day after Christmas. Pandora was a young girl with major ambition and the looks to match. Every magazine and newspaper had at least one article on her. Toy sales soon began to soar through the roof. Our profit margin began to expand. Pandora heard the stories of dear old Saint Nick while growing up and decided to cut out the competition. On the day leading up to Christmas, Pandora bought a house from a young couple and their 3 kids for an exuberant amount of money. She hired a group of hired guns to sit in the house and wait. These are all hardened veterans of the Iraq and Gulf War. The next morning, the house was destroyed. Bullet holes peppered the walls. Blood coated everything in the entire house, but the absolute worst part was their bodies. Every single soldier had been shaped into the form of candy canes, with their skin stripped to form the coloration of the candy. Coal had been shoved into their eye sockets and through where their hearts should have been. The coroner had said they had been alive long after the torture started. I learned all of this in 5 minutes. Pandora came to my house in tears, mascara running down her youthful face. After I had calmed her down, she told me the story I had told you. Members of Hasbro are dying from the top down. Pandora's father was found in his home, gorged by what they are calling antlers. The press secretary was found strangled to death with Christmas lights. When Pandora sent a group to meet with Santa and discuss a truce and peace, he sent them all back in evergreen coffins. She told me this before she left, that there are dozens more like them, and to run before it was too late. I am writing this on my laptop from the back of a taxi on the way to the airport. I can see the wooden sleigh drawing closer and closer, but I know that no matter what happens to me, the truth will be out. Please be careful this holiday and remember, Santa Claus can't be trusted. I'm 25 years old now, and I've just never been able to get ahead for some reason. My resume consists of one part-time joke of a job after another, yet I've got a degree. I've got no addictions and no lack of energy. To make matters worse, I've got 2 children to take care of, by myself. I guess that's the long and the short of why I jumped at the chance to participate in the psychology experiment at BYU. They were offering $500 for a single day's work. There was no way I could pass up that kind of easy money. For once, I would be able to afford more than just secondhand thrift store presents for my girls. That excitement is what helped me skip over all of the disclaimers in the contract that Dr. Phelps put before me. Since that day, I've reread the contract 100 times, sick at the thought of what I overlooked. There were clauses that allowed the researchers unfettered access to private documents and records. I guess that's how they got everything they needed to know beforehand. And there was another clause stipulating that they weren't responsible for any of the lasting effects of the experiment. Yet, somehow, they forgot to add a discretionary clause, which is why I can now publicly call them out for what inhumane conditions they put me through. Not just me either. They put 4 of us through hell. The college campus was just a short distance away from my babysitter's house, so I just walked it. It was under 20 degrees out, but it couldn't touch me, not through the excitement of the $500. They had all 4 of us squeeze into the professor's little office while we waited to be called out. We were all instructed to make no communication whatsoever while we waited. First out was a woman named Whitney, who was handed a blindfold and led down the hall. Next was a man named Josh, who was given a little stack of index cards and led down the same direction, not blindfolded. Next up was me, blindfolded. I felt a little uneasy at first, but the assistant leading me down the hall had a passive, polite voice. When I was directed to sit, I heard a feminine sneeze behind me. I assumed that I must be sat next to Whitney. I heard the last nameless female participant shuffle in, and Dr. Phelps cleared his throat.
2 of you are seated with blindfolds, and before you stand 2 more with index cards containing specific directions. You are paired by gender, male submissive, female dominant, and vice versa. Those seated and blindfolded being the submissive, obviously. No physical harm will be inflicted upon you, obviously.
I heard Whitney let out a sigh of relief. Suddenly I was feeling less tense too. Still, the silence and the blindness was unnerving. There was the sound of a card flipping over, and a shaky voice broke the silence. It belonged to a young man.
Whitney, your brother was murdered recently, was he not? I have some...
Wait, Terrence, damn it! We have to muffle the other...
shouted Dr. Phelps. There was a lot of shuffling and cursing and apologizing, and suddenly there were big headphones covering my ears. I couldn't hear a thing. So I just sat there, thinking about Whitney and her lost brother. Naturally, I started thinking about my wife, Jennifer, before her fatal car accident. I always tried to remember her moments of life, but I could never forget the way she looked in those last moments on the hospital bed, lying in a coma, covered in 3rd-degree burns. It felt like hours before my headphones were finally removed. A heavy door had just slammed shut, and beyond the walls, I could hear a woman crying and screaming at someone. I heard the dragging of feet over the wooden floor and impotent yells for them to release her. From the silence beside me, I can only assume that they had hauled Whitney outside. But why was she screaming and crying so much? I knew in some small part that it must have had something to do with the brother she'd lost.
It's just to be expected.
I could hear the professor muttering to someone else.
They read the contract.
Still, sir, replied another hushed voice. That was cruel. The doctor cleared his throat, cutting off his assistant, and spoke in full volume.
You may proceed, Lily.
Still, her screams were outside, growing fainter. It awoke a feeling of terror in me, like an infection, and I thought to tear my blindfold off right there. I thought to demand what happened to Whitney. I thought to call the entire experiment into question. But then I remembered my little girls. I remembered what I came here to get. I'm so sorry, came the broken whisper from the other participant, Lily. From the sound of her voice, I figured she was standing just a couple feet away from me, in front of me. I'm sorry.
Read what's on the card, Lily, barked Dr. Phelps. Do not say anything else, please.
My name is Lily Briscone, she said, and I knew your wife before I murdered her. Even despite her obvious reading voice, that sentence managed to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jennifer wasn't murdered.
It was a freak thing, a hit-and-run accident, wasn't it? I tried to convince myself it's just part of the experiment, but the further Lily went on, the more convincing it was that everything this woman was saying could be true. Your wife and I went to school together here at BYU, with you too, she went on. You probably don't remember me, but I sat in the back of class in POS 320. I'm the girl you called an idiot in front of everyone because I thought Australia was still a territory of England. I remembered that, but not her name. I couldn't even put a face to the person I had called out like that. Could it really have been her? I had more classes with Jennifer, so we started hanging out with the same crowd. I remember you've always been antisocial, so you were never around, but your wife only continued what you started. She was always finding ways to make me look dumb. She and I had to pee at the same time once at a house party with one bathroom. She spitefully sat there with the door locked, talking to you on the phone while I waited. And then I couldn't wait anymore. I peed my pants and everyone saw. Lily no longer sounded like she was reading off the cards. The more she spoke of, the more emotionally enraged her tone became. She was slipping into the words and the reality just as much as me. It was starting to really feel like this fucking woman killed my wife. I'm sorry, she whispered again. Lily! The professor snapped. 4 months ago it was now, she said more quietly than before. Her voice was growing weaker with every sentence. 4 months ago, someone drove their car into your wife's vehicle and fled the scene. I happened to be drinking at a bar nearby that night, said Lily. I distinctly remember how I stumbled when I walked to my car, how much trouble I had pulling out with double vision. I was drunk, but not too drunk to notice Jennifer's car across the intersection at a red light. And there she was, that bitch. She started turning right, and I punched the accelerator, shooting through the red light. I don't know what came over me. I felt possessed. My car was just an extension of the hatred that I had developed for her, so I gassed it and braced myself for the impact. I saw her head crash against the window in a plume of red liquid as we collided. It took me a second to recover, but my car was still working. Barely. I could have reversed. I could have unblocked her driver's side door, but... Lily broke off and spoke to someone else now, someone beside her. I can't! My fucking God! Why are you making me do this? Look at him, Then you get no reimbursement, Lily, cut in Dr. Phelps. I saw that her engine had caught fire, Lily shouted, powering through the words as if they were venom in her throat. I could hear the determination to finish, and the reluctance to articulate. She was clearly conflicted, but something drove her on. Was she finally coming clean? Is that what was so hard? And so I stayed there, she said in that loud, steamrolling voice. I looked around the intersection, making sure no one saw me as I kept her door pinned shut with my car. Then, the fire spread to the interior. Even as she jerked and jerked at the door handle to get out, I never moved an inch. I kept it pinned in. Inside me, something had come to a boil. I was no longer in a psychology experiment. I was nowhere. I was nothing, if not fury itself. I could see it all happening. Every fucking word she spoke was spinning in reels in my mind. I was there in the intersection that night, transported by my blindfold and Lily's account to see my wife burning to death. And her screams for help were like a sweet song in my ears, Lily shouted, straining against something invisible lodged in her chest. And I looked straight at her and made eye contact. Her eyes got wide as she recognized me, and Lily was choking back tears now, unable to go on. And I laughed at her life in my hands, the frail bitch. And then I saw a car coming, so I reversed and drove away before they could see me. But I hear she did quite a bit of suffering before she finally gave up and left your ass here with your kids. I heard the note cards crash to the floor, but in the next moment I was on my feet. In one motion I flung my blindfold off and I gripped my hand around her skinny throat. The rage was a sheet covering my eyes, but eventually they let the light in, and I saw. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no malice, no hate.
There was only sadness welling in her deep, blue eyes. So I released her. Even before the assistants could reach me, I tried to speak, but no sound came. We just stood there, silent yet awake, in unison. "You didn't kill her," I said at last. "Fucking experiment." I would have thought that the realization would ease my mind a little, but I got no reprieve. That sick, acidic burn remained in my stomach as they led her out of the room, shaking and crying. The professor waited a few moments before coming up to me with an envelope.
"Well, you ruined the experiment," he said. "Contractually, I shouldn't pay you. You were supposed to remain blindfolded and answer questions about what kind of legal trial and sentencing your wife's murderer should have gotten. But I think we all know the answer you would have given anyways."
"I would have said put her down," I answered vacantly. My head was still reeling, so it took me a moment to remember the experiment. I still had that sick, violent feeling like my wife did actually have a murderer, rather than the random hit and run. It was overwhelming how that dull pain I had become used to could just be reopened and made even more excruciating than I thought possible. Dr. Phelps pushed the check into my hand anyways and led me out.
"You know, this is really a fundamental flaw in our justice system," he said. "When you made the deceased family hear the accounts firsthand, and hear the voice of the killer, anyone would be ready to push for the death penalty, or to continue to fight year after year against allowing them parole."
I thought about that as I walked back to the sitter's house through the biting cold, but it just didn't sound like a flaw to me. Maybe it really isn't the right to sentence someone to death, but it sure as hell seemed right when I was listening to Lily speak. I would have put her down myself. That day haunts me just as much as when Jennifer died, but I can at least hope to see my daughters smile and throwing wrapping paper all over the room when Christmas comes. Despite those sick, fabricated images seated in my mind, at least this I know to be real. My daughters are going to have a lot of presents this year. One of my favorite parts of Christmas Eve when I was a kid was story time. I grew up in a big family, and every year my parents would have the whole gang over. All of my aunts and uncles from both sides of the family, my 8 cousins, and my grandparents. Of course, being kids, my cousins and I all thirsted after the gifts that we would see pile up under the Christmas tree like falling snow. But after we'd unwrapped our new toys and we were completely numb from how much food we'd eaten, we would gather around at our grandmother's feet and she would tell us stories. Grandma was a great storyteller. She always had this twinkle in her eye as she leaned in close and whispered to us, "Once upon a time." The whole room would fall silent when Grandma spoke. Even the adults in the room would turn their heads and listen to whatever concoction her brain had come up with that year. The multicolored lights from the Christmas tree would twinkle behind her head and match that glimmer in her eye. My grandmother died earlier this year. It's going to be our first Christmas without story time. Even as my cousins and I aged into our teenage years, our parents into their 50s, and our grandparents into their 80s, my grandmother never stopped telling stories. Christmas this year isn't going to be the same. Recently, I've been reminiscing about Grandma's story time, trying to remember her greatest hits. I've been wanting to remember them as accurately as possible so that maybe I can make note of what I remember and go from there so that I can keep the Christmas storytelling tradition going when my cousins and I have children of our own. I've remembered about 7 of Grandma's stories so far, but the reason I'm writing this on No Sleep today is because I've remembered another one that she told when I was about 10 years old. This story is a peculiar one, the only bizarre one that Grandma ever told us, and I want to share it with you guys. I don't remember exactly what the title of the story was, but it goes something like this, in my own words. What is a child's favorite part of Christmas? The presents, obviously. And after Mommy and Daddy, who do children immediately think of when they see presents under the tree? Santa Claus, of course. The big man in the bright red suit, jolly laugh, and herd of reindeer to pull him through the snowy night sky as he delivers presents to every good kid around the world. There is not a single child I know that doesn't get excited when they think about Santa Claus. Good kids get presents, and naughty kids get coal. At least every kid gets something. But Santa's challenge isn't just about getting around the whole world in one night and delivering presents. No, he has more to worry about than that. You see, children, Santa doesn't visit every house, but every house gets a visit on Christmas Eve. Not many people know this, but there's another Santa, except, of course, he isn't Santa. Physically, they look more or less the same, except the other Santa doesn't wear a bright red suit. He looks different to every child. He doesn't have a jolly laugh, he just stares. He doesn't drink milk and eat cookies. In fact, he doesn't eat anything. He doesn't have a sled pulled by reindeer, and he doesn't come down the chimney. No. He gets in through the back door or from the basement, and he knows where all the children's rooms are. He never delivers presents, but he does punish the naughty children. How bad the punishment is depends on how bad you've been that year. He can make children very sick. Some children visited by him have had the stomach flu that lasted 2 weeks, where they nearly died from dehydration. There are some accounts of some children whose parents or pets just vanished in the middle of the night, never to be heard of or seen again. In the more extreme cases, some naughty children have had their houses burnt down, losing everything and everyone in it except themselves. My grandmother had heard of this boy named Bobby, who lived a few towns over from her growing up. He was visited by the other Santa one year on Christmas Eve. According to what she had heard from the neighbors, Bobby had woken up in the middle of the night because his dog was whimpering, and he had the worst pain in his foot. Getting up to see what was wrong with Baxter, he fell face down as soon as his feet hit the floor because, well, all of his toes had been cut off. You could tell whoever did it probably used a saw because of the tendrils of skin and shattered pieces of bone that were sticking out where his toes used to be. There was blood all over his sheets. Bobby screamed and screamed, and his dog's whimpering just kept getting louder and louder. Bobby couldn't take the sound, and despite his pain, he managed to drag himself across the floor all the way over to the kitchen, where his dog was. When he found him, his screams just kept coming. Baxter was kneeling in the corner of the kitchen, where he also saw his father sobbing and holding a baseball bat crouched beside the body of his mother. Her teeth were scattered all over the floor, and her face was pulpy with blood and bone. She twitched incessantly on the floor while Bobby's father sobbed and his dog whimpered and Bobby screamed. But how did you know who was going to be visiting you on Christmas Eve? Santa or the other Santa? You didn't, Grandma said. If you've been naughty, you better pray and pray and pray that all you received that year was coal, and not a horrible sickness or a dead family or missing body parts. Although I don't remember the story exactly as Grandma told it, there is one thing I remember that she said once the story was done, which was a bizarre thing for her to say since we were all so young. I also remembered she had made sure the story time this year was told in a room where the rest of the adults couldn't hear her tale. Why do you think Santa and Satan sound almost exactly the same?